So moving on to toms, and with, I guess, toms being one of the least hit pieces on a kit, at least for this kind of music anyway, there's actually not even that many instances to choose from to dive in and look into mixing them. Let's look at this little fill that comes between the verse and the chorus. That uses the rack tom and the second floor tom. And we'll use this as kind of the basis for seeing how I process toms. So I'll just play the fill for a second just to get us situated. So with toms, I'm kind of looking for a similar thing that I look for in bass drum and in snare, which again is this kind of big smiley face EQ curve. As in, that's what I look to see on a frequency analyzer post EQ. So typically when you see a tom un-EQ'd, and these are the EQ settings here that I used on the rack tom, you're going to get a lot of note clustered around the fundamental tone of the drum. Then you're going to get a lot of mud kind of immediately above it in the frequency range. You're probably going to get some mid-range that kind of has that kind of gulpy back of the mouth kind of, I don't know how better to describe it than that, but that kind of really boxy mid-range character that sits a bit higher up in your kind of 700 to 1K range. And then you're probably going to find that you have to bring out a bit of extra attack and sometimes shape where the attack is focused. The Q Drumco kit that we used here in the Modern and Massive session had coated drum heads on it, which kind of instantly shifts the presence peak down a little bit from a clear head. A clear head tends to have like quite a plasticky sounding kind of airiness to it, while a coated head tends to sound more rolled off. And you can kind of see up here that I'm cutting a bit of 5K, which I guess it would be where you get the presence peak on a coated head, and instead then boosting in a bit of like 10K, which is, I mean, I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but trying to give it a bit more of that kind of clear head vibe. I think that coated heads sound great, and I think it's entirely a great choice for this song here. I just wanted to bring out a little bit more clarity up there. So you can see here my moves are, I've got a high pass filter, I've got a cut kind of on where I could perceive the tone of the drum, like the actual note, just because it's such an overwhelming amount of frequency centered around there. I still want to hear the note, it just needs to be controlled a little bit. Then I've got a bit of a cut, quite a large cut here, 10 dB at 350 Hertz, that's that mud region I'm talking about 8 dB around 1K. As I mentioned, that's kind of your boxy, kind of just ugly sounding frequencies to have on toms. So let's just take a little listen to the rack tom, and I'm going to keep it soloed here, and you can see how the frequency response is going to look through the frequency analyzer of the plugin. So you can see that initial impulse of top end almost kind of balances out in level with the fundamental tone over to the left-hand side of the frequency analyzer. But it does die off a lot more quickly, and that's kind of what you expect with a tom. It's that note that stays ringing on. With this being a 13-inch tom, it's got quite a deep note to it. So even though technically it's a rack tom, you're starting to approach the realm of a floor tom in terms of the tone anyway. I use a very similar principle on the floor toms, on all kinds of toms really, but the frequency points are going to have to move. I mean, typically always the fundamental tone is going to move down on a lower tuned tom. So typically as you go to a bigger sized tom, and then generally your kind of mid-range mud cut and your kind of boxiness cut are going to move down a little bit too as the drum increases in diameter. But the presence peak aspect is really dependent on a lot of factors like the microphone positioning and, well, I mean, all of these things are dependent on the microphone positioning, but just don't be afraid to use quite different looking EQ curves on the different toms of the same kit. If the resulting frequency landscape looks very similar, you'll find that the drums all tie together nicely. Something that I always want to hear in my mixes when drummers use the kick drum in between the toms, when you hear really fast fills between the hands and feet, I want them to I want the toms to have a tone to them, but I love that effect of the attack sounding quite similar on the toms and the bass drum, so that when they're played in quick succession, you get just this really consistent sounding attack between those instruments. So this is where, again, the frequency analyzer really comes into its own, because you can really dial in where the attack is which you can do by ear. It's just a lot more difficult to do consistently between instruments like that. And you can just get fills that really sound very consistent between all the drums and that. So it's kind of like a really thrilling sound when you hear a drummer playing a really fast fill, and it just sounds like almost like they're playing an entire kit of kick drums, but some of them have like much more sustain than toms. So that's kind of my ethos to toms. Let's just take a little cursory look at the EQs which I've applied to the floor toms. You can see a similar deal here. On this one, I think I've probably used the high pass filter to tame down some of that low end bump. Plus, of course, the low end, the fundamental tone of this 16-inch tom is getting really quite far down, and probably the microphone's not quite as efficient as picking it up as it is on the rack tom. So it might not need as much cutting of low end there. But similarly, 250 hertz I'm cutting, 700 hertz, and I'm cutting a bit of that same kind of 5K region. This one didn't seem to need any extra airy boost on top. And then on floor tom 2, yeah, look, I've gone for a really huge cut here, and this time it's closer to 200, while this one's about 650 on the 18-inch tom. So I guess, you know, what I'm saying holds true. You can see that these mid cuts are shifting down as the tone of the drum shifts down. And then typically up here you've got your kind of 5K cut there. So to then move on to the tom bus, I've got three things going on in the actual bus, which these individual tom close mics are feeding to. The first thing I've got here is a limiter, and I'm using the classic Old Waves L1 limiter here. Kind of similarly to the snare, I'm trying to shave off a bit of transient in order to get kind of fat rock sound. I want to be able to hear the tone of the toms, and if the attack is too prominent above the tone, like if the actual transient's too spiky, it's really difficult to find a level for the toms where they don't jump out at you too much, but you can also hear the tone of the drum. Because if there's a really huge transient, you try and turn them up loads to hear the note, and the attack is just out of control. So this is where a limiter can really come into handy. And I'm not using it to increase volume, I'm just using it to lop off a transient. So, I mean, I'll just hit play and we'll see how much gain reduction I'm getting here between the two toms. So you can see the rack 1 was getting, what, about 3 dB, and the floor 2 was getting over 6 dB. This also adds a consistency to the sound. So when you hear a drummer play a really fast fill, or just play through the toms in general, this limiter is going to ensure that the peaks of the attacks are very consistent. Even if perhaps the hits are not 100% consistent, this limiter is going to help make it sound like every hit was hit very evenly. Next up, I'm using a little bit of the SPL Transient Designer to cut sustain here. Now, it's great to have long sustaining toms. You know, when you tune a really resonant tom to sound great, it's typically going to have a really long note to it. However, in the mix, sometimes that note can be a bit too much, especially on the floor toms. They can kind of overwhelm the mix if they hang around for too long. So I like to use a transient designer to kind of reduce the level of that sustain. You're still going to hear some of that initial impulse of low end coming through right after the transient, but then this is going to kind of cut it off a little bit, make it sound almost like you put a noise gate on it, I suppose, without losing any hits if they don't cross the threshold of a noise gate. So, you know, this is a bit of a better solution as far as I'm concerned. I'll just show you what this sounds like. I'll play that same fill and I'll turn up the sustain and then cut it again so you can hear the difference. So for me, that's just giving it a bit more of that kind of, I guess it's a bit more rock that way. It's funny when it comes to heavy drums, so much of getting the desired sound is about adding attack and then taking it away and then adding it again. It's kind of funny. It's just a strange process that I guess we've evolved to like hearing on rock recordings, and sometimes it takes these slightly kind of bizarre, long-winded routes to get there. But this particular thing I think works really well, especially for neatening up the low end in your mix. You just have to treat it with care. If you cut too much sustain, then you're not going to hear the note of the drum like I was talking about earlier with the limiter. Finally, I'm using our GGD Smash and Grab comp here on Tom's mode, as you'd expect. And I've got it on Smash, and I'm doing this again to further trim down the transient a little bit more. So this is another bit of work that I'm doing here to reduce the initial transient spike. And I'm also using the mix knob here, so I've got it set to fairly heavy compression, and I'm using the mix knob to dial back the effect of that compression in order that it doesn't sound too extreme. I'm going to make this loop a little bit longer just so it's not really annoying. Here we go. It's the toms soloed, and I'll keep this bypass and then engage it. Now, even though the attack is really quick in smash mode, there's still just a tiny bit of transient flap that gets through, which sounds really good on toms, as far as I'm concerned. So I really love using that GGD comp on the tom bus, on that tom setting. And like I mentioned, you know, that is quite a different thing happening under the hood than you get with the other modes. I'm also running this into the parallel compression, although at a much lower quantity than I ran the snare drum. And I'm also running it into the reverb too. And that just about finishes it up for toms. They don't take as much work, I've found, as long as they're well recorded. I think toms are one of those things where if they weren't tuned really well, then you're going to be fighting them. But thankfully here, you know, you've got some really great tuned drums in this sample library. And I think the toms are one of those things where if it's not a really good sounding drum that's been tuned well, it's almost impossible to salvage in the mix. But thankfully, these are really great sounding drums from Q Drum Co.